definition of in-person reenactment is found in the credits of a biopic, biographical film. On one side, the actor's name and surname, on the other, a notation, as himself, as herself. I mean to question the self-evidence of this identity by looking at two celebrity biopics. Torero, in which the famous Mexican bullfighter Luis Procuna plays himself, and Sophia, her own story, in which Sophia Loren acts herself and her mother, Romilda Villani. Always at odds with the time it represents, the real actor is an active and disturbing revenant, whose surplus of presence generates a deep uncertainty regarding its status, its performative effectiveness, and its relation to an original time and experience. I discuss here a group of films that stands at the antipode of known reenactment films such as Abbas Kiarostami's Close Up, Joshua Oppenheimer's The Act of Killing, or Werner Herzog's Little Dieter Needs to Fly. While these films' ethical and exemplary dimensions remain central to any consideration of the real actor, I will turn to the actor and sports figure biopic, a common reenactment subgenre that places extra stress on the star's named, recognizable body. Biographical films such as the Jackie Robinson story, Endurance on Haile Gebrselassie, a long-distance Ethiopian champion, or The Greatest, the story of Muhammad Ali's career, exploit the celebrity presence in conventional rise to fame plots. But even at their most banal, these films invite a reflexive awareness of the actor's body in cinema. They promote a protracted access to the star's talents, the change for a fixated gaze on their bodies in action. As importantly, the star as herself puts her identity and physical makeup literally on the spotlight, inviting a phenomenological scrutiny that sharply frames the passage of time over bodies. It is this confrontation with mortality and age that guides my discussion of the ontological and existential dimensions of reenactment. The obsession with mortality in Torero and the circular replication of mothering and origin in Sophia Loren's dual role as her mother and herself provide a testing ground to examine the tension between the autonomous, multi-directional temporality of reenactment and cinema's affinity for registering the linear flux of a lifetime. I contend this tension is especially apparent in biographical films on and with the star herself. Celebrity reenactments are conservative modes intent in confirming the integrity of the star's identity. And yet the decision to immortalize at once one's story and one's image exposes the actor and athlete's representation to the same quandaries noted by Jean-Louis Comolli and André Bazin apropos of actors incarnating historical beings. In his article, Historical Fiction, A Body Too Much, Comolli noted that once an actor stands for a known historical figure, in his example, the actor Pierre Renoir, for Louis XVI, the image blurs. The body becomes ghosted by what we may know about that historical person through circulating images, portraits, or verbal accounts. And I quote him, "If the imaginary person has no other body than that of the actor playing him, the historical character filmed has at least two bodies, that of the imagery and that of the actor who represents him for us. There are at least two bodies in competition, one body too much." Comolli's analysis builds upon André Bazin's writings on mythical figures from Stalin to film stars. In his 1950 The Stalin Myth in Soviet Cinema, Bazin puzzles out the phenomenon he sees as unique to contemporary Soviet cinema, its depiction and deification of Stalin while the statesman is still alive. For him, what most complicates the correlation between cinema and represented lives is the timeless dimension of either history, a la Stalin, or of celebrities. For him, to make Stalin the determining force in the recreation of an actual historical event when he is still head of the state implicitly establishes that the meaning of his life has been definitely ascertained. What is foreclosed in the representation of a myth is its contradiction with the flow of history. In the case of stars reenacting themselves, this discrepancy is marked on their aging bodies. Bazin's texts on mythical figures trail particular films and stars along two incompatible horizons: the actor's contingent life and the star's immutable fate. He emphasizes cinema's specific share in a preservative process and on the medium's ability to create a gelled imprint of a changeable existence. And especially when writing on actual stars, whether alive, aging, or dead, he is compelled to puzzle over cinema's ontological perversion, its animistic and resurrecting function. His texts frequently adumbrate death, flagging precisely the fugitive marks of humanity in his beloved stars. When he outlines Jean Gabin's destiny, an inevitable death fulfilled in each of his characters. When he describes how even prior to his death, Humphrey Bogart resembled a corpse in reprieve. His texts resemble a macabre party where guests in various degrees of decomposition or with different or even competing claims to liveliness and uniqueness commingle. Almost without exception, Bazin's work on Chaplin is about a body constructed and ravaged by cinema. Interweaving the man's ephemeral destiny with his filmic corpus, Bazin associates cinema with existential time. The unavoidable malaise affecting the film's skin can only be recognized in human, mortal terms. Bazin's fascination lies with seeing time and cinema work over bodies. Meshing flesh and celluloid, Bazin has cinema partake in the fading star's finitude. At the same time, his exfoliation of the person in cinema reveals the actor's literal presence. His resistant, rigid body provides a glimpse into cinema's human dimension, precisely as it meets its reproducible afterlife. The Bazinian reflection on the gap between existential and cinematic destinies, on miscasting and aging celebrities, is central to the question of whether reenactment, the actual presence of the film protagonist as actor, centers or scatters the bodies too much, that beset the representation of existing beings. Star reenactment films foreground the question of the literal body pitching its physical profilmic limits against its cinematic afterlives. Below we discuss how Luis Procunha's reenacted presence fares against other versions of himself in Torero. Surprisingly, André Bazin's fascination with the human body in the cinema, suspended in a limbo between life and death, between mythical immortality, physical decay, and existential fragility, did not translate into a concurrent interest in the paradoxes of reenactment. Bazin wrote on Cesare Zavattini's experiment with literal reenactment, marveling at the absurdity of casting the actual protagonist of a story, Caterina Rigoglioso, as actress in the story of Caterina. He also wrote extensively on the obscenity of representing death in cinema, but he never touched on the obvious relation of reenactment to this ontological limit. Bazin famously proscribed death from cinematic representation, linking cinema's ontology to its power to represent an event in its time block, to reproduce the inexorable linearity of life's progression. He concludes that the possibility of replay has, and I quote, only one point of intolerable ontological contradiction: death. Clarifying the incompatibility of existential and cinematic times, he conclusively explains why the uncanny that so obsesses him, the passage from animate subject to inanimate object, has to be left off screen. Cinema's scandal, he claims, is that it is capable of having us watch this monstrous spectacle to re-die. The temporal and corporal limits of death should be enough to define the inverse interest of reenactment, i.e. replaying one's life, reversing its forward course. To recap on camera a stretch of one's life constitutes a figurative delay of mortality. In reenactment, it is precisely those instances linked to existential corporeal limits, risking one's life as in Torero, or embodying one's mother and oneself in her own story, that obviate the discrepant temporalities at play in biopics featuring the actual protagonist. My topic converges with Bazan's writings in a review he devoted to Torero, a film by Carlos Vela, in which Luis Procunha, bullfighter, reenacts the story of his life. Typically, whenever Bazan writes on bullfight films, that was a favorite genre of his, he establishes a hierarchy based on the protagonist's risk. There are compilation films like Pierre Malbranger's La Course des Taureaux, and fiction films. Some are played by actors and by real bullfighters as stand-ins in the arena, while others insert documentary images of actual bullfights to stand just for the dangerous moments. In Tarde de Toro, 3 fictional toreros are played inside and out of the arena by known bullfighters. Bazan praises its integral realism, since according to him, and I quote, "As soon as the camera gets close, the corrida scenes are actually interpreted by matadors that risk their lives and really kill the bull." Strangely, when writing on Procunha's biopic, Torero, Bazan does not ascribe its originality to reenactment. What impresses him is the fact that the newsreel images of Procunha are, in his view, indiscernible from the reenacted scenes. Velo, Torero's director, was a Spanish filmmaker who immigrated to Mexico during the Civil War. What clinched his interest on making a biographical film on Luis Procunha was the wealth of archival material in Noticiero Mexicano and the Cineteca Mexicana since the start of the bullfighter's career, including his memorable return to the arena in '54. Velo had worked for several years directing newsreels, and in the early '50s had started working for Manuel Barbachano Ponce, an innovative producer who had ventured in short films and started a series, Cine Verdad, in 1953, a synthetic portrait of Mexico the same year that Zavattini makes his experiments with reenactment in the story of Catarina, an episode in Amore in Città. Torero retraces the morning of Procunha's last recorded bullfight, his breakfast with his children, getting dressed, kissing his wife goodbye. On the way to the arena, the car radio announces his return after a long period away from the sport. And gradually the stakes of his afternoon are articulated. Procunha needs to prove he is not afraid. In the car, a close-up of his face refracts the sentiment spelled out in the voiceover narration, circling around the risks of bullfighting. Intercut with flashbacks of his earlier life, it is this close-up that is charged with reenacting a fear he had already conquered 2 years prior to the making of the film. Likewise, all the audience reactions were culled from other bullfights. Velo explained that since he had hundreds of bullfights in the archive, he only had to select those that had a torero with a similar clothing, cutting the face out in editing. This footage of body parts works as a supplement in Velo's film, much like the actors or actresses that lend a given star their naked bodies, body parts, or who risk themselves in dangerous scenes. Body doubles, like stuntmen, are used as stand-in for the stars, and it is their physical resemblance to them that assures they will never be seen. While André Bazin appreciated Torero for its transparent continuity, it is instead the film's anxious relation to discontinuity and death that emerges in the film's proliferation of doubles for Procunha. Procunha's presence and life story are propped up by a parade of celebrities, Carlos Aruza, Manolete, who are watched displaying their art, risking death or dying. But these celebrities who lend the biopic historical veracity, as well as other toreros whose identity is erased, masked by the match-on-action shots, imply that a compensatory economy is at work in the film. The film can then be seen as an extended choreography in which Procunha staves death, either by fusing with other bullfighters' bodies or avoiding contact, safely watching from afar as other toreros are violently thrust by the bull. He is either physically stitched through editing to other toreadors' body parts, or he watches them from a distance, and I'm showing an example of each. Two central scenes in this film's fixation with mortality involve Procunha's relation to Manolete's death. In the first, Procunha is the pallbearer for his friend Joselito, another bullfighter, and in the next scene, he learns of Manolete's death. In this scene, Procunha explicitly says, he enunciates the film's problematic of surrogacy and identification. He says here, in front of the grave, if it could happen to someone like Manolete, then it could happen to me. As we saw in the film, this me is mediated by multiple proxies. Like the other inserts of body doubles whose identity has been effaced, the shadow lends to this visit to the grave an aura of authenticity. An indexible sign par excellence, the shadow asserts an existential link between an actual human being that has passed by Manolete's grave at a precise moment in the day, and yet its relation to Procunha is artificial, it's fictive. The array of documentary images suturing Procunha's reenactment into the narrative exposes the structural fragility of the real actor's presence in biopics. It is precisely reenactment's functional and temporal elasticity, the fact it is acted and scripted and can therefore fill in the gaps of a life not fully documented, that marks it off visually and ontologically from the radical contingency of the newsreels as they record punctual but fleeting moments in which a particular bull's horn tore through a particular storero's flesh. According to David Rowe, writing on sports films, what draws the spectator ever closer to the sense of an irrecoverable liveness that gives to broadcast sport its overwhelming power is the unscripted narrative unfolding in real time. In contrast, and despite the surplus of iconicity as a hyper-real double-dub Procunha, the torero's existential anchor to the represented moment is second-hand, it is borrowed. Procunha's homage to Manolete by the grave epitomizes reenactment's artifice, its constructed relation to contingency. At the same time, in this film, it poignantly reveals how reenactment works to literally defer mortality. As he mediates his contact with the dead through another person's shadow, Procunha avoids even the slightest brush with mortality. He can thus move away, reiterating his presence as himself, in this case, as not yet dead. In the star biopic, reenactment becomes another way of negotiating the star's image. Discussing Bette Davis and Joan Crawford's fictional performance of aging stars, Jodie Brooks notes that, and I quote, "These characters and their performances offer a form of crisis in which time is loaded to breaking point. The temporality of the commodity, the temporality of stardom for women, the temporality of women as image. Both their refusal to leave the stage and the ways that they negotiate their status as image, meaning Crawford and Davis, take the form of stretching time, of repacing the temporality of spectacle, display, and performance. In Sophia, her own story, rather than stretching her performance's pace, reenactment is used to conserve and stabilize Sophia's appearance for an extended block of time. The typical contraction of aging in reenactment affect the actor's age does not vary, as the span represented in the story time helps in keeping the stars ageless. Instead, the film reserves aging to impersonating her mother. Both Torero and Sophia's own story become exposés on the quandaries of representing oneself in time. The proliferation of Procunha and Sophia images in each film suggests that when biopic and reenactment cross each other, they become unintentionally prone to deconstruction. Notably, this excess has a different bearing in each film, even as they both relate to existential limits. In Torero, Procunha avoids mortality by having others stand in for him, while Lauren takes on multiple roles, and her voraciousness for the limelight works as a warranty of immortality. In 2010, astonishingly, and I only discovered this completely as I was finishing the paper, a 75-year-old Sophia Loren reenacted her mother once again. This time in her sister's story, who also published a book and was made into an Italian television film called My House is Full of Mirrors. And I suggest you just Google it to take a look. Much like in a writer's autobiography, the replay of an expertise, be it acting, running, boxing, is valued as a signature, a self-expressive element of the star's professional identity and individual style is enacted alongside their impersonation of their own characters. In addition, the actor in sports reenactment enhances a reflexive awareness of the various levels of repetition threading through one's lives and body. Watching these films, one is inevitably tries to discern being from acting. One scans the physical body for breaches of common humanity or of an embodied technique. One attentively separates cyclical gestures and repetitions that are part of a biological makeup, breathing, say, from movements that are part of a reiterated productive effort, acting, exercising, or sprinting to win a race, as in this example from The Greatest with Muhammad Ali. Okay, one of the aspects that interests me in reenactment, one of the aspects that interests me then is reenactment's recursive dynamic, its ability to set in motion deeply rooted unconscious patterns of behavior. To conclude, I want to discuss two contemporary films that have mobilized this recursive dynamic to question the value of agency and consciousness in reenactment projects. So this is a big shift in terms of the material that I'm dealing with here. In Rudy Penn's S-21, the Khmer Rouge killing machine, the ex-guards of the Khmer Rouge are brought to reenact a routine of torture and murder at the very site where they took place between 75 and 79. In the second film, Sons by Zhang Yuan, a family of 4 reenacts a repetitive routine of addiction in the 10 days preceding their commitment of the father to a mental asylum for alcoholism. Reenactment has historically worked as a mode of self-revision and catharsis, privileging the real actor's consciousness and memory as the model of transmission from past to current self. I believe that the critical force of the real actor in contemporary film hangs instead on representing an ambiguous or problematic agency. The films I'm about to discuss, and very briefly, amplify this opacity, magnifying through reenactment unconscious behavior that is already ingrained. In S-21 by the imprint of ideological indoctrination, and in Sons through addiction. S-21 centers on an extermination site, the public school S-21, where around 17,000 people were tortured and killed from 75 to 79 by the Khmer Rouge. The director, Rudy Penn, models his juridical order on a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, promoting a meeting between Van Nath, one of 2 survivors, who fails to get any admission of responsibility from the guards that tortured him. Filmed against stark backdrops, empty rooms and corridors, the Khmer Rouge ex-guards recite public confessions extracted under coercion or mimic their torture routines. The historical function of this location, which was a public school that turned into a prison camp and is now the Tuol Sleng Memorial Museum, come perversely alive to this ghastly theater. Without any summary description, each imaginary action and prisoner gets an exclusive abuse, with the repeated locking of the door a measure of the regulated road. In a sort of methodology, each gesture is doubled by its literal description, a present tense commentary. Each action compacts distinct forms of repetition, the daily routine, the protocol that is allowed thinking, and finally the retracing of these acts in an imaginary time-space. For the viewer, these scenes open the question of whether replay is transformative, whether it raises one's consciousness about one's past actions. Scholars have likened the mechanized moves in S-21 theatrical reenactment to the stunted narrative of psychically traumatized patients. From a psychoanalytic perspective, the paradox of traumatic experience is that the literal registration of an event, the ability to reproduce it in exact detail, corresponds to his inability to recompose a narrative about the past. But as we consider the effects of the scene for the film, the question becomes how this opaque acting is put to critical use. The effortless mimicry of the guards' atrocities brings an extraordinary ethical and categorical instability to S21. In one scene, a group of ex-guards inscrutably witnesses once again the regulated script of the Kampuchea Republic recited in a new historical stage and in the liminal space of a film. Slogans spouted in automaton-like fashion years later prove that their system emphasizing growth and critical learning has indeed formed into an archive for future replay and may be spun quite simply through another round of recitations, even if in the guise of theater. Sophia Loren, her own story, has provoked us to reflect on the different logics of resemblance, genetics, age or social group that authorize reenactment's identity fictions. With Sophia, her own story is a template for the wild crossing of two notions of transmission, motherhood and reenactment. I want to briefly explore whether the Rio actor's artificial identity, its protean temporality, and revisionist capabilities can be understood in light of another matrix for creation, that of natural filiation. At stake in this initial reflection is the intersection of two temporal constructs for transmission of an original past, one aesthetic, selective, and multidirectional, the other deterministic and unidirectional. Family ties, heredity, and surnames, potent signs for origin and succession, would seem to be in tension with reenactment's aesthetic and temporal autonomy. But the question I want to raise is whether reenactment's aesthetic discontinuity can critically feed off of the physical lineage and continuity transpiring in films featuring the real protagonists and their families. Reenactment is a fictional strategy of actualization, a form of substitution that asserts some sort of continuity with the original past. But reenactment is not reducible to verisimilitude, and its temporality is as flexible as its potential function. It may work to ritually renew the bonds with an original event, to belatedly provide an exemplary image of conversion, or to create a form of embodied memorial. The Rio actor's replay always introduces a differential, a disturbance. As we saw in the celebrity biopic, it was the corrosive force of time, the estrangement of oneself that became visible via reenactment. Focused on the phenomenology of literal reenactment, I want to consider whether the physical resemblance linking the Z family members may not be the driving factor in the film's critical cyclicality. As we begin to speculate on the seepage of corporeal aspects into the text, we may consider whether and how should evidence based on biological and genetic presuppositions enter into an analysis of representation. What bearing does the body of the Rio actor have in these narratives once reenactment sets in action alternate theatrical, ritual, or purging forms of recursivity? Regarding reenactment, the same replicating logic implied by genetics and resemblance applies to habit and routine. And the question becomes then whether one may read the sedimentation of time in gestural patterns and voice intonation. In Richard Schechner's felicitous collocation, performance is restored or twice behaved behavior. And it can have, in the case of daily acts, a constancy of transmission across many generations. The question the film raises, the film Sons raises, is whether the temporal looping of bloodlines and its implication of fatalism is reiterated or instead ruptured in this family reenactment. In Sons, addiction, drinking, taking drugs repeatedly may be just a visible dimension of a more disturbing organic and genetic replication, a senseless mimesis that would place in question the creative rupturing force of aesthetic replay. If cinema is ontologically defined as frozen flux, reenactment is an exercise in the reverse direction, that of a critical mortification. In Sons and S21, we watch a reflux, a regurgitation of the real, in repetitions that seem unconscious, accidental, compulsive, strange similarities, hereditary vices, coincidences. My term to suggest the way reenactment perpetuates the ambiguity around the relation between autocratic orders, genetic legacy, and the recidivist behavior depicted in Sons, or how reenactment exfoliates and brings out one more round of Khmer Rouge indoctrination, is affiliation. By that I mean to emphasize what I believe to be the greatest aesthetic and critical interest of in-person reenactment, the ways in which replay becomes a perverse, embodied form of historiography.